Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a world where flirting could be dangerous, even ruinous. Not in the oops, sent the wrong emoji kind of way, but in the guess who's now on the church gossip scroll kind of way. Imagine this. You're standing in the chilly stone corridor of a Tudorara court, surrounded by the scent of beeswax, polish, and too much wool. Someone catches your eye across the hall. Your heart skips. But be careful if you hold that gaze a beat too long. Congratulations, you've just publicly declared your undying love. Or worse, your loose morals. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, if you're watching this in bed, let me know in the comments, what city are you tuning in from, and what time is it right now? I love seeing where we're all dreaming from now. Dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're not even trying to flirt, you're just being polite. You glance up, smile at someone across the hall, it's a reflex. But this is 1540, and politeness comes with fine print. A man meeting your eyes too long might be accused of being bold, which is 16th century code for scandalous. For women, it's even worse. Returning that gaze can be seen as an open invitation, or, depending on who's watching, an insult back. Then, looking wasn't passive, it was active social currency. Eyes were tools of intention. Even the act of making eye contact was part of an elaborate system of coded behavior, because you didn't just live in society, you performed. In it, every glance had implications. Every moment of silence could be filled with meaning. And it didn't help that people were watching, literally. There were servants, chaperones, even eavesdropping clergy. Some courts had women called mistress of the robes, whose job wasn't just fashionate with surveillance. Proper conduct was a team sport, and the audience was always ready to gossip in noble households. Young ladies were trained to keep their gazes downward, demure and unreadable, looking up too quickly, suspicious, holding a smile, questionable, blushing, dangerous. Some manuals even advised girls to think of the Holy Mother when in the presence of men, which, let's be honest, feels a bit like bringing your grandma on a date. Of course, this made things complicated. Imagine trying to flirt when you're not allowed to smile, talk too much, or even blink in the wrong direction. And yet, this was the age of courtly love, of poetic longing, of serenades and sighs. Somehow, despite the rules, people still found ways to connect. In fact, the stricter the rules, the sharper the game. A quick glance across a banquet hall, that's not just eye contact, that's an act of rebellion. An entire novel compressed into half a second. That's the thrill. No one else knows what passed between you two but you know. And in that, knowing, something blooms. Historians still debate just how universal these rules were. In rural areas or among common folk, things were looser, less protocol, more practicality. But in royal courts and upper-class households, social interaction was basically a chessboard, and your eyes, your opening move. What's funny is, the risk made it better. You weren't just trying to get someone's attention, you were sneaking. Emotion passed a system designed to suppress it. And when someone looked back, just for a moment, it felt electric. Not because it was passionate, but because it wasn't allowed. One odd little fact. In some regions of Italy, a woman could legally accuse a man of visual harassment just for sustained staring. Yes, even in the Renaissance, people had laws about eye contact. And no, it didn't always end well for the accused. So here you are, Standing by the fireplace, trying to remember how long is too long to glance. 1 second, maybe 2. Your palm starts to sweat inside your embroidered glove. You look away, heart racing, and when you risk a second glance, they're still looking and smiling. Is this the start of something, or just a social death sentence? You'll find out soon enough. Asterisk, you're seated in a grand hall, where the air smells faintly of lavender and wood smoke, and the candles flicker just enough to cast elegant shadows across the floor. Your dress or doublet is perfect, your manners impeccable, but none of that matters right now, because across the room, your love interest just lifted a fan, slightly, then snapped it shut. You freeze. Was that a message? In the 1500s, flirting wasn't just about what you said, it was about what you did, and more specifically, how you did it with the everyday objects you already had in your hands. Fans, gloves, handkerchiefs, they were like the emojis of their time, only instead of a question mark, you had to remember that holding your glove in the left hand meant I desire to speak with you, while fidgeting with it meant you're annoying me and also maybe stop talking. Let's talk about fans first. For women, especially in Spain and later in France, the hand fan became a full-blown flirting apparatus. Entire manuals existed outlining the language of the fan. Some moves were simple: opening and closing it slowly meant I'm thinking of you. Hiding behind it, I like you, but we're being watched. Touching it to your lips, well, that one's self-explanatory. Of course, this system only worked if the other person knew the code, which means part of the game was guessing. Was that a sign or just a heat wave? And gloves, oh, gloves were deliciously ambiguous. You could drop a glove on purpose, classic. Or you could toy with the fingers of it while pretending to listen to someone else, dangerous. A glove handed back with a smile could mean yes. A glove handed back without eye contact, a death sentence to your romantic aspirations. And this is where it gets fun. You didn't have to own the object for it to mean something. You could borrow a glove and refuse to give it back. You could ask for someone's fan to cool yourself, but keep it until they asked for it in private. You could send a handkerchief back with perfume on it, and that definitely meant something. Academic debate time. Some historians argue that this entire language of objects thing was exaggerated by later romantic writers, especially during the Victorian era. According to this theory, most people didn't actually have fan flirting playbooks in the 1500s. But even if the rules weren't universal, the gestures still carried weight. After all, in a world where you couldn't say I like you without risk of scandal, people got creative. One noblewoman in Elizabethan England reportedly trained her parrot to say, "Kiss me," whenever a certain knight walked by. Romantic, maybe. Unhinged, also maybe. Here's a weird one. In the courts of Central Europe, lovers would sometimes communicate through fruit. If you received a pear wrapped in linen, that was a warning. Someone suspects us. A pomegranate slice. Meet me at the fountain. The fruit often ended up uneaten, but emotionally, it was delicious. You right now have just dropped your glove by accident. You wait. 1 heartbeat. 2. Then they bend down to pick it up. They brush it off unnecessarily. Hold it out to you with a look that says, "I understood that your hand touches theirs for a second too long." You say thank you like it's the most casual thing in the world. But inside, you're screaming, and they're smiling now. Not a big smile, just the kind that curls at the corner of the mouth. They might fan themselves next, or fiddle with their ring. Either way, the game is on. You're not just two people in a crowded hall anymore. You're co-conspirators in a silent conversation made of silk, lace, and carefully timed gestures. And everyone else has no idea what's going on. You wake up to the rustle of parchment. Not from your own bed, of course, but from your chamber door, where a folded letter wrapped in silk ribbon has been slid just beneath the threshold. You tiptoe over, heart fluttering. The paper is thick, the ink delicate, and as you unfold it, a faint scent of crushed rose petals rises up to greet you. This isn't just a note. It's a whisper in the dark. In the 1500s, love letters were more than heartfelt messages. They were a high-stakes form of romantic espionage, when you couldn't speak freely because, well, someone was always watching. You wrote, and when you wrote, you were expected to be poetic, flowery, drenched in metaphors. If your quill didn't weep ink from longing, were you even trying? But make no mistake, these letters were strategic. Every word, every fold, every choice of wax seal or perfume was part of the performance. You weren't just expressing emotion, you were building tension, creating a moment. Let's start with ink and paper. Black ink was typical, but brown or red suggested passion. If someone used gold ink, there was either wildly romantic or wildly rich or both. Parchment could be perfumed, pressed with flowers, or even get disinfused with elixirs meant to stimulate desire. Basically, a Tinder message and an aphrodisiac rolled into one, and the writing itself, usually disguised, code names, aliases, references to mythical lovers. Calling your crush Venus or my northern star was way more common than using their actual name. Why? So if the letter was intercepted, which happened all the time, you could deny everything. Now here's the kicker. Letter delivery was dangerous business. You couldn't just drop it off at the local post office. You had to rely on bribed servants, trusted confidants, or occasionally even trained pigeons. Seriously, in some Italian courts, homing pigeons were used to ferry short messages between castles. There's an infamous case from the French court where a love letter was accidentally delivered to the wrong duchess, who happened to be married to the king's cousin. Let's just say the original sender ended up doing some searching in a monastery for several years. Historians still debate how widespread these romantic letter customs really were. Some argue it was mostly a game for the upper classes, while others suggest even middle-class merchants wrote love notes filled with Shakespearean flair. What is clear is that love letters were a way to push against the boundaries of public decorum and intimate rebellion sealed with wax, and the seals. A broken seal was more than a privacy breach, was an insult, an invasion, sometimes even a political move. In noble circles, wax colors had meanings. Red for passion, blue for loyalty, green for jealousy, yes. Jealousy was apparently an entire mood worth sealing. You, right now, are reading your letter behind a bed curtain. The message is vague, almost annoyingly so. If the moon smiles kindly upon Thursday's gathering, perhaps the night will yield a word or two between us. Until then, I remain your humble shadow. It's ridiculous. It's romantic. It makes your stomach twist in that sweet, unbearable way. You carefully fold it back, tuck it into the lining of your sleeve, and go about your morning like you didn't just received the 16th century equivalent of a 2 a.m. text that says thinking of you. Except it smells better. Asterisk, the music begins, soft at first, like the rustle of silk skirts, and murmured gossip, and you take your place in the great hall. The floor is polished wood, your shoes freshly brushed, and the chandeliers above glint, like stars trapped indoors. Tonight, it's not just a dance. It's a public test of timing, grace, and romantic nerve. In the 1500s, social dances weren't just entertainment. They were the only acceptable excuse to touch someone of the opposite sex in public. And even then, only barely. Each step, each spin, each hand hover, yes, hover, not hold, was choreographed like a royal ceremony. You weren't just dancing, you were flirting under surveillance. You glance at your partner. They offer a shallow bow. You curtsy. It's polite, elegant, and a little too long to be just courteous. The dance begins. Let's talk the pavantha. Classic, slow, gliding court dance of the 16th century. It's less of a shake-it moment and more of a walk with incredible dignity while secretly dying inside sort of thing. The rhythm is stately, the movements restrained, but the tension off the charts. Because here's the thing, while your hands might only touch briefly, your eyes, those do the heavy lifting. A glance on the turn, a soft smile during a bouch moment, a tiny spark in a room full of barely contained bonfires. But there were rules. Oh, so many rules. Hands must not linger. Eye contact must be brief. Smiling, fine, but don't show teeth. And if your fingers accidentally brushed during a pass, that would be discussed for weeks. There's even documentation from a German court, where a nobleman was banned from dance events for impropriety during the galliard. What did he do, you ask? He lifted his partner's hand too high. That's it. Too enthusiastic with the wrist flourish. Scandalous. Academic opinions vary on how flirtatious these dances really were. Some scholars argue the choreography was so controlled, it stifled romance. Others point out that within those strict boundaries, people became very good at pushing limits. And honestly, it makes sense. When the world gives you one narrow hallway to run down, you sprint. Here's a fun and mildly horrifying detail. Some noble families kept dance diaries. That's right, teeny journals that recorded who danced with whom and how many times. The Earl requested Lady So-and-so for the third galliard. Why? Because 3 dancers with the same person in one evening. That was basically a marriage, proposal, or a prelude to a scandal, or both. Back on the dance floor, you execute a perfect half-turn. Your partner's hand brushes yours not by accident. Their pinky lingers for the briefest moment. A silent message. Maybe they'll say something later. Maybe they won't. But for now, this is everything. The music slows. You bow. They nod. You return to your seat, heartbeat thudding, face carefully neutral. And the room carries on as if nothing at all just happened. But you know, and they know. And maybe someone across the room is writing it in their little dance diary right now. Asterisk. You sit at your writing desk, or maybe your embroidery frame, or your lute stand, or whatever makes you look both talented and marriageably and a servant. Tiptoes in with a box. Small, velvet, tied with a crimson ribbon. No name, of course, just the scent of cloves and maybe danger. Inside, a thimble. That's it. One tiny, pewter thimble. But your heart skips, because you know what this means. In the 1500s, gift-giving wasn't about grand gestures. It was about strategic subtleties. Sure, nobles might exchange jewels and land for political gain, but when it came to courtship, the most romantic gift might be a ribbon, a carved spoon, or yes, a humble little thimble. Because what mattered wasn't what you gave, it was why, how, and when. A gift was a coded message. sometimes sweet, sometimes bold, and sometimes so specific it required almost a full degree in Renaissance flirtation studies to decipher. A pressed flower might mean I remember, a carved figurine I dream of you, and an orange yes. The fruit could mean your beauty is rare and expensive, which, let's be honest, is still a decent compliment. Let's talk handkerchiefs again. Gifting a handkerchief, especially a monogrammed one, was like sliding someone your contact info and a handwritten poem at the same time. Receiving one, especially with lacework, was a silent "I'm thinking of you." Dropping it, that's next level drama. Here's a fun one. In England, gifting a lace-edged garter was very suggestive, as in, we've moved past the fan stage. But if a glove was returned inside out, that meant I regret this courtship and will henceforth avoid you like spoiled mutton. Very specific, very brutal. Historians debate just how literal these meanings were. Some argue the symbolism evolved more through poetry than real-life practice. But surviving letters and inventories show people truly did put thought into objects. Court records show women gifting feathers from exotic birds, locks of hair in small vials, or even miniatures of themselves painted on ivory. One French nobleman apparently gave his lover a fork made of silver, an exotic rarity at the time. The message, "You deserve refinement." Or possibly, "Please stop eating stew with your fingers." Either way, effective, and yes, smell mattered. Gifts were often perfumed, not just with rose or lavender, but with ambergris, musk, or citrus peels. In a world where personal hygiene was, let's say, inconsistent, scent carried heavy romantic weight. You right now are holding the thimble. It's smooth and plain, but there's an engraving on the rim, TV. No last names, just initials. That's enough. You remember the conversation from last week, the way they asked if you were still mending your gloves yourself, the way they smiled when you nodded. This is a memory wrapped in metal. You tuck it away in the drawer with your other secret treasures: one ribbon, one sprig of dried lavender, and a pressed leaf from the garden wall. Your own quiet museum of maybes. Later tonight, you'll send something back. Maybe a silk thread, maybe a plum, maybe a book with a page dog-eared. That's the game. A slow-motion conversation built from objects, exchanged under candlelight, interpreted with a racing heart, and no one else needs to know a thing. Your candle burns low, the wax pooling like melted secrets at the base. You hold the parchment close, not because the ink is hard to read, but because it's hard to believe. The poem isn't signed, but you already know who wrote it. In the 1500s, poetry was the slow-burn seduction of its day. A flirtation so refined, so dramatic, and often so overwritten that you sometimes needed a second cup of mead just to make sense of it. But once you did, oh, the thrill. Because when someone called you the moon's jealous twin, or the echo of a nightingale's sigh, you didn't roll your eyes. You blushed, or swooned, or read it 3 more times in your chamber while pretending not to smile. Let's be clear, poetry wasn't just for bored nobles with too many quills. It was a performance of passion, a declaration wrapped in metaphor and dipped in honeyed vowels. It was how you told someone you were obsessed with them, without ever using the word obsessed. There were 3 main types of romantic poetry, circulating then: Petrarchan love sonnets, full of unrequited longing and melodramatic metaphors, like comparing your crush to a deer in a forbidden forest. Courtly verses, short and clever, written to impress during feasts or dances. Occasionally absurd rhyming couplets, which were basically pickup lines, dressed in velvet. Shakespeare, of course, gets all the attention. But he wasn't alone. There were anonymous poets scribbling lines onto scraps, ladies composing verses on the back of hymnals, and even soldiers penning romantic rhymes between battles. One lesser known but charming trend: acrostic poems, where the first letter of each line spelled out the beloved's name. It was romantic and provided deniability. No, Your Grace, I wasn't writing about Lady Anne. See, it could also spell anvil. Of course, not everyone was a poetic genius. There are plenty of preserved love poems from the era that are, well, awkward. One from a young nobleman reads, "Thy eyes are like two orbs of wet. I dream of thee, but mostly sweat." He tried. We respect the effort. There's ongoing debate among historians about how widely poetry was used among the general population. Some claim it was a high court art, inaccessible to most. Others argue that even tradespeople and scribes dabbled in verse, especially in cities like Florence, where literacy was spreading and love was in the air, or, at least in the bakery, you, right now, are still staring at the parchment. The poem reads, "Were I the breeze that stirs thy hair, I'd kiss thy cheek, so soft, so fair. Yet here I sit, with ink-stained hand, a coward's hope, a heart unplanned. It's not Shakespeare, but it's something." You fold the paper carefully. You don't show anyone, but tomorrow you'll leave a book open on your writing desk, with a tiny note tucked between the pages. I prefer the breeze that stays. Just 7 words, a perfect, poetic reply, and they'll get it. Oh, they'll absolutely get it. Asterisk, you're standing by the window. The moon is out, casting silver across the stone floor. You have no words to say because, in this moment, words are not the point. You take a deep breath and exhale it just a little more slowly than usual there. That's the signal in the 1500s. When conversation was censored, poetry took planning, and even a glance had consequences. Sometimes all you had left was a sigh. A well-timed sigh was like the emoji of the Renaissance. Melancholy, longing, flirtation, yes, all of it. And depending on how you side length, volume, even the angle of your head could mean "I love you, I miss you," or "Please notice that I'm dramatically yearning" from across the room. This wasn't passive-aggressive. This was full-on courtship theater. According to etiquette manuals of the time, sighing in public was only acceptable under certain conditions. If you were recently bereaved, that counts. If you were reading a particularly moving passage of scripture, technically legal, or if you were clearly caught in noble contemplation, which basically meant romantically frustrated but classy about it. In fact, during Elizabethan England, sighing became so trendy that playwrights mocked it. One stage comedy included a character who sighed so often that other characters mistook it for illness and tried to bleed him. But for real people, a sigh was useful. It gave you plausible deniability. You could look toward someone, sigh softly, then pretend you were simply thinking about the weather, or your dying aunt, or the rise in grain prices. Here's a strange historical note. Some households kept scented pillows specifically for romantic melancholy. You'd rest your head, sigh dramatically into lavender-sprinkled linen, and let everyone know your heart was burdened. Basically, the 16th century equivalent of posting sad poetry to your Instagram story. Academics still argue over how intentional these sighs were. Some say they were unconscious expressions of repression. Others insist they were deliberate tools in the flirtation toolbox. After all, even Shakespeare wrote, "Lovers ever run before the clock," which might be a fancy way of saying they can't shut up about their crushes, even when they're trying to be quiet. You, right now, are walking through the garden. You know someone is watching. Not obviously, but enough to notice. So you pause by the fountain. You close your eyes. You let out the softest, most wistful sigh you can manage. Not too loud, not too dramatic, just enough behind you. A door creaks slightly, then closes again. Maybe they saw, maybe they didn't, but they'll think about it tonight. That moment, that sigh, that pause. Tomorrow, they might ask if something's troubling you, and you'll say, with a perfectly straight face, "Oh, nothing at all." Because in the 1500s, nothing spoke louder than pretending everything was fine. Asterisk, the banquet is in full swing. Laughter echoes off the high stone walls. Trays of roasted meats pass under candlelight. Goblets clink. Harps play something that sounds suspiciously like this night is going to change your entire life. And then it happens. You look up and meet someone's eyes, just for a moment, but maybe a little too long. In the 1500s, eye contact was one of the most electrifying, dangerous, and misunderstood social moves you could make. It seems so simple now, locking eyes with someone across a crowded room, but back then, that could cost you your reputation, your marriage prospects, even your social standing. To look someone in the eyes wasn't neutral. It was an action with consequences, especially between the sexes. A fleeting glance could be interpreted as interest. A second glance, desire. A third, scandal. In fact, in many noble courts, there was a sort of unspoken eye contact countdown timer to 1 second. Acceptable curiosity, 2 seconds. Mild flirtation, 3 seconds. Someone's mother will hear about this by morning, and if you were caught smiling during it, that was practically a wedding proposal. Manuals on conduct from the period are very clear on this. "A modest maid looketh not full into a man's face," wrote one English cleric, and 4 men. They were warned that the prolonged gaze leads the heart to mischief. That's poetic speak for "you're gonna get in trouble, bro." Even church sermons warned against lust of the eyes. In some sermons, prolonged eye contact was ranked alongside envy and gluttony, just below, murder. But naturally, the very thing that was forbidden became irresistible. Historians still debate how literal these eye contact taboos were. Some argue that written rules were exaggerated, while others insist that in elite social circles, where everything was performative, the gaze was the message. And the more tightly controlled the environment, chaperones, social pressure, religious overtones, the more powerful a single glance became. It was rebellion. It was poetry without words. There's even an old French term, loyal coolant. The melting eye used to describe the kind of look that lingered just long enough to burn itself into your memory. You, right now, are walking back from the musician's corner with a plate of pears and cheese. Totally normal. You're just passing by the hallway alcove when someone catches your gaze. They don't smile, they just hold your eyes for 1 heartbeat. 2, then they look away. You feel your ears go warm. Your pace stumbles. You put one of the pears back down, wrong tray. Whoops, no one else seems to notice. But your entire inner world just flipped over like a rowboat in a storm. Later, someone asks if you're feeling well. You say, "Just a bit warm tonight." You don't mention the gaze, or the fact that you're still thinking about it hours later, long after the music ends, because in the 1500s, falling in love didn't always begin with a conversation. Sometimes it began with just a look. And if you were very lucky or very reckless, that look was returned. You're walking through the gallery, a long, echoing corridor lined with tapestries and judgmental portraits of ancestors you've never met. You hold your posture high, your chin modestly tilted, and in your hand is your handkerchief monogrammed. Stitched with care, smelling faintly of rosemary, and then oops, it falls, not directly in front of you, of course. No, you angle the drop ever so slightly toward the boots of a certain someone coming the other way. You don't even look back. Just enough pause to register the sound. The moment, the trap. Because in the 1500s, dropping a handkerchief was the ultimate act of accidental seduction. It was subtle. It was silent. It was risky. And it was wildly effective if you knew how to do it right. This wasn't about being clumsy. This was choreography. The precise timing of the drop. The elegance of the pause. The way you turned your head back just so to see who picked it up, if they noticed, if they understood. The handkerchief wasn't just a cleaning cloth. It was a portable symbol of femininity, often handmade, sometimes perfumed, and always meaningful. To drop it was to open the door, to pick it up. That was walking through. But of course, there were layers to the message. If you dropped it and someone returned it silently, it meant I saw you, but I choose caution. If they smiled as they returned it, it meant I accept the invitation. If they pocketed it, well, that was bold. That meant we are in this now. This tradition shows up in literature, plays, and even royal gossip. There's a persistent rumor, maybe apocryphal, maybe not, that Queen Elizabeth I once returned a suitor's handkerchief by setting it on fire. No words, just a smoking heap of linen and a very awkward court dinner afterward. Modern historians are still divided on how common or codified the handkerchief drop really was. Some believe it was more of a poetic motif than a widespread social move. Others point to etiquette books and diary entries that hint at a more literal practice. But whether symbolic or practiced, the message was clear. This wasn't just about dropping fabric. This was a gamble, a test, an invitation wrapped in lace. And you've just played your hand. You keep walking, calm, serene, inside. Your pulse is chaos. Behind you, there's a soft scuff of boots. A pause, then the faintest rustle of linen being lifted. You reach the end of the gallery and turn around. Your eyes meet theirs. They're holding the handkerchief not high, not showy, just waiting. You approach. They offer it back. No words, just that smile. You take it slowly. Maybe your fingers touch. Maybe they don't. Either way, it's electric. For the rest of the evening, you tuck the handkerchief away. But you don't clean it. You don't use it. You just carry it, because now it means something else entirely. Asterisk, you're seated at the edge of the feast hall, halfway through a roasted quail and trying very hard to pretend you're not listening to the person across the table. They're talking about falconry again. But then, with the perfect flicker of a grin, they look at you and say, "Well, I do believe your silence is almost as sharp as your tongue." You blink, you sip your wine, you smile. Game on. In the 1500s, flirting didn't always sound like sweet nothings. Sometimes, it sounded like a duel. A dance of words sharpened like daggers, but tipped with velvet. Because in an age where open affection was discouraged and most feelings had to be politely buried under layers of etiquette, banter became the loophole. A safe way to test the waters, send a signal, or just annoy someone until they noticed how charming you were. this wasn't the same as being rude. A proper court flirt knew the rules. Insult the behavior, not the person. Smile while delivering the jab. And never, ever go too far unless you want to start a family feud. Think of it as verbal fencing, complete with footwork, timing, and the occasional dramatic gasp. For example, your dancing is truly unique. I've never seen elbows move quite that way. I heard your lute playing has cleared entire rooms. A rare gift. I must ask who dressed you tonight, so I may avoid them forever. Historical records and plays are full of this kind of teasing. In fact, Shakespeare's couples Beatrice and Benedick in Much Ado About Nothing, for instance, were practically the blueprint for 16th century flirt comedy. Their entire courtship was insults wrapped in iambic, pentameter, and it wasn't just on stage. Letters, journals, and even royal court records include references to sharp-tongued maidens and gallants whose compliments stung like bees. These weren't insults meant to wound, they were meant to provoke laughter, blushes, and maybe an extra dance at the evening's ball. That said, not everyone was good at it. There are letters preserved in museum collections where some poor soul tried to banter and utterly failed. One suitor wrote, "Your eyes are like torches. They hurt my vision." Okay, points for boldness, maybe not for charm. And here's the secret. Beneath the insults was always the unspoken tension. The understanding that if you didn't like someone, you wouldn't bother teasing them. It was affection in disguise, a wink wrapped in a barb. Some historians believe this playful cruelty was actually a clever tool for avoiding censure, because if anyone overheard, you could always claim we were simply jesting, even if, underneath the jest, you were quietly building a love story. You, right now, are refilling your wine glass when they lean closer and say, "Do be careful, too much of that," and you may say something intelligent by accident. You arch an eyebrow, and wouldn't that still put me ahead of you? They grin, you grin. The wine isn't even the best part of tonight anymore. Later, someone asks if the two of you dislike each other. You just smile and say, "Oh no, I find them tolerable occasionally," which, in 1500s flirt speak, might as well be a confession of undying love. Asterisk, it's late, later than you should be awake. The candles have burned down to nubs, and most of the house is asleep, save for the creak of old wood and the occasional sigh of the wind. You step softly toward the window. Just a quick glance, you tell yourself. A breath of air. A moment alone. But really, you're hoping they're there too, because in the 1500s, windows weren't just architectural features. They were stage sets for silent romance, especially in townhouses and estates where private meetings were rare and public ones were dangerous. The window game, that quiet ritual of leaning out, glancing down, maybe singing a line or two, was how many relationships began or ended, or simmered somewhere in between. The idea was simple. If you liked someone, and they liked you, but neither of you could say anything directly, you waited. After dusk, curtains drawn back just enough, maybe a candle lit, or a flower pot shifted slightly to the side. Signals, signs, whole conversations in gestures and glances, carried out above cobbled streets and moonlit gardens. Some lovers left small notes tied to pebbles and gently tossed them toward an open sill. Others recited lines from popular ballads, hoping the right person would be listening. And in certain Spanish towns, a practice known as ventaño, literally Windowing was so common that some families posted guards to monitor who looked up at their daughters' rooms. But even those guards couldn't stop the creativity. People climbed vines, used polished mirrors to reflect candlelight, traded glances under the guise of stargazing. There are even accounts of musicians hired to perform under windows, not for coin, but for courtship. And when you couldn't sing yourself, you paid someone who could. The window became a sacred space, part confession booth, part stage, part escape hatch. Of course, not all windows were equal. A ground floor window was convenient, but risky, too easy to be caught. A second-story window, more romantic, more dramatic, and also more likely to result in someone falling into a rosebush. There are at least 2 documented cases of noblemen injuring themselves while boldly attempting a vine-assisted serenade. One broke an arm, the other broke pride. Historians debate how widespread this behavior really was. Some argue it was mostly a literary trope, exaggerated by troubadour songs and romantic poems. Others cite household journals that mention nightly visits to the sill or interrupted sleep due to whispers near the shutters. You, right now, lean just slightly out your window. There's no moon tonight, only the distant glow of lanterns and the chirp of insects, then movement. A shadow across the courtyard. There, not close enough to speak, but enough to see you, to know you're there too. You don't wave, that would be too much. Instead, you place your hand lightly on the windowsill. They do the same, just for a few heartbeats. No words pass between you, but still everything is said. Tomorrow you'll act like nothing happened. You'll pass each other in the corridor, cool as spring water. But tonight, you're both just stories. At the window, you're seated under the heavy gaze of 3 generations of oil-painted ancestors, trying to sip your tea without trembling. Across from you sits the object of your affections, looking inconveniently dashing. Beside you, however, sits Madame Thornbridge, your aunt, chaperone, and living embodiment of a no fun allowed policy. She clears her throat. Loudly, you drop your eyes back to your teacup. He drops his to his boots. The silence thickens. In the 1500s, courtship wasn't just a matter between 2 people. It was a communal event, featuring a rotating cast of chaperones, maids, brothers, tutors, family, friends, and occasionally even the family priest. Everyone was invested in making sure nothing happened, which, of course, only made you want something to happen even more. But here's the genius. People adapted. Love found ways to sneak between the rules. You learned to flirt in code, to speak in layers, and to turn every shared moment, no matter how scrutinized, into something secretly electric. Let's break it down. A chaperone's job was to prevent physical contact, absolutely no hands, monitor conversation, no suggestive phrases, no poetry with the word thigh, report back to your parents with flair, and your job to outwit them. Quietly, this led to entire systems of subtext. A simple "may I refill your cup" might mean "I'm thinking about you." A choice to sit across rather than beside someone could be an act of boldness or defense. Even the type of question asked, "How was your reading today?" could imply longing if you'd once exchanged notes hidden in a book. Fans, gloves, books, these returned as props. But now the stakes were higher. You had to make every gesture plausible in public, but personal in private. One brilliant move. The shared reading session. 3 people, 1 book. You'd read aloud in turns, and every time you passed the book, your fingers would brush, by accident, of course. Literary scholars still debate whether the Book of the Courtier was popular because of its content, or because it was just long enough to justify multiple hours of eye contact across pages. There's a recorded case of a noble woman in Milan who flirted so successfully under chaperone supervision that her family increased the number of observers. She adapted by coughing twice whenever she needed her crush to stop talking, and tapping the heel of her shoe for yes. Eventually, they married. The chaperones were not invited to the wedding. Historians agree, chaperoning didn't stop flirtation, it just made it better. It turned courtship into a chess game, a duet in mime, a lesson in dramatic restraint. You, right now, pretend to be absorbed in the embroidery pattern draped over your lap. He pretends to be interested in the Windows draft. Madame Thornbridge adjusts her shawl like she suspects everything. And then, quietly, he says, "You seem fond of lilies." You glance up. They bloom best when watched carefully. A pause, a twitch of a smile. Madame Thornbridge sneezes, which somehow feels symbolic. You return to your knee. The work. He returns to the window. The conversation is over. But in your mind, it's still unfolding, because in the 1500s, flirting under supervision wasn't impossible. It was just beautifully inconvenient. Asterisk. You're standing in the corridor, just outside the hall, candlelight flickering against the tapestries. The chatter inside fades to a warm, muffled hum. You shouldn't be here. They definitely shouldn't be here, but you are. And they are. And between you, held delicately, reverently, is a single, embroidered glove. In the 1500s, gloves weren't just for warmth or fashion. They were messages, promises, sometimes even proposals. In an age of layered meanings, the gift or exchange of a glove was one of the clearest and most emotionally loaded acts of romantic intent. It starts with the basics. Gloves were intimate. They touched your skin, held your warmth, absorbed your scent. They were custom-fitted, carefully stitched, and often perfumed with ambergris or crushed petals. A glove carried you, and to hand someone that, it was like handing them a fragment of yourself. The symbolism ran deep. To gift a glove meant I favor you. To wear someone's glove at a tournament was to publicly show allegiance or affection to return. A glove could mean I acknowledge your feelings or never speak to me again, depending on how you handed it back. And here's where it gets tricky. The way the glove was returned mattered more than the glove itself. Placed gently in your hand, hope tossed on a table, disrespect pressed to the lips before returning. Scandalous, possibly divine. There are actual historical records of glove exchanges causing duels. One story from the English court tells of a baron who gifted his glove to a lady-in-waiting, only to see it later hanging from another man's belt. Swords were drawn. No one died, but social death was narrowly avoided. And then there were the embroidered gloves, with initials stitched in gold thread or a tiny phrase sewn into the cuff. These were keepsakes, meant to be hidden in drawers, kissed in private, and maybe, if you were brave enough, worn in public. Historians still argue whether the glove's symbolism was formalized or just evolved through fashion and habit. Some say Queen Elizabeth received over 100 pairs of gloves from suitors and ambassadors, all hoping to win favor. Others point out that glove-giving was common even among middle-class folk, especially during courtship or betrothal periods. You, right now, are still holding that glove. It's yours, monogrammed. Ivory leather with a blue silk lining. You gave it to them yesterday, carefully, casually, like it meant nothing, but it did. And now here they are, offering it back, but not just handing it to you. No, they're sliding it onto your hand, finger by finger, slowly, as if every motion is a question, and every button fastened is your answer. When it's on, they look at you. Fits perfectly, they say. You nod, it always did. Neither of you says what this really means. You don't need to, because in the 1500s, sometimes a glove was more than a gift. It was a whisper, a contract, a silent vow, warm from the other's touch. And once it was exchanged, nothing, not even time, could pretend it hadn't happened. Asterisk, your fingers ache from holding your goblet just so. The silver rim chilled, your grip dainty and disciplined. The laughter around you swells. Someone retells a hunting story for the 4th time. You glance over briefly, carefully, on your breath catches. They're near, closer than before. A mere step away, and then, as they pass behind your chair, it happens. A single touch. Not obvious, not dramatic. Just a brief brush, shove their hand against yours. Or maybe their fingertips ghosting across the fabric of your sleeve. You don't move, you don't flinch. But the moment burns hotter than candle flame. In the 1500s, touching someone you weren't married to was a serious business, and not in the fun, flirty, oops, excuse me way. It was forbidden, provocative, sometimes punishable. A brush of the hand could lead to whispered accusations. A palm on a wrist that might end in a reputation ruined or a marriage required. Touch was charged. Dangerous, intoxicating, the etiquette. Books made it very clear. A gentleman does not touch a lady without permission. A lady never initiates contact. Accidental touches must be excused immediately, preferably with shame and abound. Yet people touched because when everything was forbidden, even the tiniest sensation carried enormous weight. Think about it. In a world without texting, without late-night calls, without even being allowed alone in a room together, a single moment of skin-to-skin contact was everything. A love letter written in warmth, and it was creative. Gloves were removed by necessity. A partner's wrist was guided during a dance to help with the turn. A lace collar was adjusted because it was crooked. All excuses, all electric. In royal courts, there were rules against even accidental brushing of shoulders in corridors. One noblewoman wrote in her diary about the scandalous pressure of a hand against my back as I stepped into the carriage, and then spent 3 pages describing what she imagined he meant by it. Spoiler, a lot. Historians disagree about how strictly these rules were enforced. Some suggest rural communities were more relaxed. Others argue noble courts were obsessed with purity and propriety. But across all records, one thing is consistent. When a touch did happen, it meant something, and you're frozen in that exact moment, still, composed, outwardly unfazed. But your skin is ringing like a bell. They didn't apologize. They didn't look back, but that's the point. They knew. Later that night, as you undo the tiny buttons of your sleeve, you pause at the spot where their fingers had passed. No mark, no proof, just memory. And that's the cruel magic of it. Forbidden touches don't leave bruises, they leave hauntings. The feast is over. The candles have guttered into smoke. The chairs are empty now, save for the one you never sat in, and the cushions still warm where they had been. You're standing near the exit, pretending to look for your cloak. You're waiting, hoping, and then As the servants begin clearing the trays, you feel it. That quiet presence behind you. You don't turn, you don't speak, they don't either. But that silence, it says everything. In the 1500s, words were rationed, public ones, at least, because conversation between unmarried people of opposite genders was heavily policed by etiquette, by family, by church, and worst of all, by nosy relatives. So you learned how to communicate without them, a look, a pause, the way someone held their breath near you. The absence of speech became its own language, one only two people could understand. It wasn't just about avoiding scandal, it was about building intimacy, a secret world carved out between glances and silences. There are entire love stories from this era with more unsaid than said. One preserved journal from an English lady-in-waiting tells the story of a man who visited her garden every morning for 2 years. They exchanged greetings exactly 3 times. They eventually married. She called it the longest, quietest proposal in history. Even during dances, letters, and gift exchanges, what mattered most was the tension, the near confession, saying, "I love you" outright. Too risky. But leaving a pressed flower in a book they were known to be reading, that was a declaration. Historians often debate whether this restraint was empowering or oppressive. Some argue it forced deeper connection. Others see it as a product of repression and overbearing morality. The truth is probably both, but one thing is clear. When you couldn't speak freely, silence became sacred. You, right now, stand there, still facing forward. Behind you, they step just close enough that your shoulders almost touch. You don't move. Neither do they. Seconds stretch like hours. And then, without a word, they turn and walk away. You exhale, slowly, deliberately. That was a conversation. A promise, an ending, or maybe a beginning. Either way, it was loud enough. And now, the halls are empty. The candles have gone cold. The perfume of roses and ink and dust has settled into the tapestries like a dream that never quite finished, telling itself, you're alone in your chamber again. The fan rests on your dressing table. The glove is tucked gently into a drawer, still holding the warmth of another's hand. The poem, folded so many times it's gone soft at the edges. There's no music now. Just the rustle of the wind through the shutters and the quiet hush of a world that once burned with secret sighs and glances. All the flirting, all the longing, all the perfectly timed gestures and beautifully inconvenient feelings, they've dissolved back into silence. But that's the thing about love in the 1500s. It didn't need to be loud. It didn't need to be certain. It just had to live quietly in the pauses. And maybe, somewhere deep in you, it still does. So let it rest now. Let the stories soften. Let your breath slow. You don't need a fan, or a glove, or a handwritten sonnet to be understood. You're already seen, you're already heard, you're already home.